No problem. So we use it about
So good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Patterson. I'm one of the co-founders of the Boston Global Forum, and welcome to what in essence is our spring conference, also our pre-G7 conference. And I wanted to introduce Mike Dukakis. Mike is also one of the co-founders of Boston Global Forum, and he's the chief of Boston Global Forum. Three-time governor of Massachusetts, 1988 Democratic presidential nominee, hugely active still in civic causes in the Boston and other areas, distinguished professor of political science at Northeastern, and has one of the best gigs in the world. Every January or so, he heads off to UCLA to spend the winter in sunny Southern California teaching at UCLA. Mike.
Well, it's good. It's good to be back, but I have to tell you that this winter in Southern California was absolutely glorious. And Los Angeles is getting its act together. It just reelected a very good mayor with 80% of the vote, and it has voted to tax itself not once but twice to build an honest-to-goodness, comprehensive rail-based transit system, which is underway. It's under construction, and it's transforming the city. It's really very, very interesting. And as a transit nut who's having difficulty understanding why this city and this state can't seem to manage its transit system effectively, it was a kind of refreshing pause. Not only that, the weather was terrific. We had a fair amount of rain. The drought is over. I've never seen Southern California so green. And the last weekend of March, before Kitty and I come back, our girls who live in Denver and San Francisco bring their girls for a long weekend to spend with us. And they wanted to go up to Zuma Beach. And we've been there 21 years during the winter. And the hills up the Pacific Coast Highway were just covered with yellow wildflowers that apparently kind of sit in the desert or in pretty arid land until it rains, and then they just explode. I mean, it was really something. Anyway, it's good to be home. And we are going to spend 3 days in Nantucket looking at daffodils the rest of this week. But I start teaching in May, and we'll be teaching right straight through the spring, summer, fall. And one of the great things about coming back is the chance to work with Tuan and with so many of you on the Boston Global Forum. I'm not going to spend a lot of time except to simply remind you, I don't think you need that we've been focusing for the past over a year now on this issue of cyber and the various problems as well as opportunities that it brings with it. And that's going to be the focal point of our discussion today with an excellent paper for discussion that John Savage has prepared. And I hope all of you have had a chance to take a look at it and think about it. But we also have the pleasure to have the Consul General of Italy with us. And I just had a chance to chat with him briefly, but we talked a little bit about the history of the Italian-American community here in Massachusetts, which has been an interesting one, folks. I was the governor who issued a proclamation 50 years after the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, declaring in effect that a terrible injustice had been done. I couldn't pardon them posthumously. And I got a fair amount of flack on it from some of the folks that had been involved and were still around during the Sacco Vanzetti situation. But as I said to the Consul General, regrettably, and we're seeing this again, not just here, but all over the world, waves of immigration bring with them wonderful people, wonderful results, and a lot of prejudice. And the anti-Italian prejudice in this town back in the early 1900s, the 20s, was fierce. It was fierce. In fact, Tom Menino was the first Italian-American ever to be elected mayor of the city of Boston. Today, the Italian community obviously is one of our great jewels, but the execution of those two men was a terrible, terrible injustice. a prejudiced judge, just all kinds of stuff. So we experienced that. In any event, it's a great pleasure to have the Consul General with us, because Italy, as I think many of you know, will be hosting the G7 at Taormina, which gives John's plan a little name here. And so it's a great honor to be able to introduce the Consul General and ask him to say a few words. Nicola?
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for your kind words and for your actions toward the Italian-American community that, as you say, it had been in the past discriminated, perhaps, but I would like also to say that for the Italian-American community, no country perhaps has been so generous as the United States. So nowadays, we're proud to be Italian here, and we're proud of all the success reached by the Italian-American community. And this is also thanks to you, Governor. So dear Governor Dukakis, representative of the Japanese government, dear professors, scholars, ladies and gentlemen, it is my very honor to be here today with you, participating to the Boston Global Forum G7 Summit Initiative Conference. It is Italy's turn to hold the G7 presidency for the year 2017. The calendar will be marked by 40 high-level groups meetings, several so-called engagements groups, and 10 thematic ministerial meetings. The summit of the heads of state will be held, as you know, in the wonderful city of Taormina in Sicily on May 26 and 27. Italy takes over the G7 presidency at a particularly delicate moment in the international scenario, and this inevitably increases the responsibility and need Italy will have to exercise a stable and safe guiding role within the forum. On the one hand, as far as the political leadership is concerned, Taormina will constitute the first big multilateral event attended by President Trump. Also, for the future French president, it will be the first international appointment. For the British Prime Minister May, it will be the first G7 summit during the Brexit operational phase. Furthermore, Chancellor Merkel will find herself at the eve of her electoral mandate, which is shaping up to be the most delicate and complex moment of her entire mandate. On the other hand, at a global level, one needs to take into consideration the fact that the economic growth is low both in the advanced economies and the emerging ones. The world global transitions and investment are in a stagnating phase, and at the same time, we perceive a strong disillusion in public opinion around the world toward the benefits of free trade, with the consequent re-emerging of protectionist tendencies. Furthermore, unemployment, particularly among the young generations, is still at high rates, in particular in European countries. The competition and the dumping process at a social level by several emerging countries, along with the consequences on jobs generated by the digital economy revolution, are all aspects that worry and create tensions within our societies. Persisting international crises with difficult solutions, the terrorist threat and radical extremism, and the emergency related to the extraordinary refugees and migrant crisis are increasing a sense of insecurity and loss of control for our citizens. Such fears are allowing the growth of populism and anti-globalization sentiments all over the world, further invigorated by the anger over the inequalities, not only in income, and by the perception of insufficient social justice. All this dangerously increasing the distance and mistrust toward governments, the ruling classes, and economic establishments, particularly by the middle class. To face these threats with credibility and to answer with resolution to such fears, it is, at this point, an absolute imperative for all governments. For this reason, the Italian presidency intends to put an emphasis on placing at the center of the agenda political actions to meet the needs of citizens in terms of economic well-being and security, working to reduce social inequalities and growing fears. We need to give voice to the urgency, restarting a dynamic growth which will be inclusive, sustainable, and innovative, allowing the benefits of globalization to reach everyone. Rebuilding foundations for trust is the Italian presidency slogan. Framing in this fashion our citizens' needs, the Italian G7 presidency will articulate its program among three main pillars. The first pillar is security for our citizens, which will focus on the concerns deriving from the geopolitical instability, terrorism, and unchecked immigration, with a consequent natural geographic focus on Middle East and the North Africa region, MENA. In this sense, the agenda will consider the crisis situation in the Middle East, which are threatening global stability, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and on the unstable area of the sub-Saharan Africa. Within the MENA framework, Italy intends to be advocate to launch again the Deauville Partnership, an initiative to support the institutional capacity and economic reforms of the so-called Arab countries in transition, ACT. As far as the fight against terrorism is concerned, Italy will continue to sustain the International Alliance for the struggle against the Islamic State and for suppression of financing channels used by terrorist organizations. A priority of Italian politics, and therefore of the Italian G7 presidency, is to tackle the deep roots of the human mobility phenomenon which we are witnessing. On migration issues, we will attempt to promote a principle of partnership with the main countries of origin and of transit for migrants, based on economic support, health projects, and infrastructure investment, with the objective of gaining stronger collaboration from the beneficiary country in the management of migrants. The second pillar among G7 priority is the economic, environmental, and social sustainability and the reduction of inequalities. This identifies the instrument through which our citizens' needs are addressed, better articulated in the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. All the initiatives promoted by Italian G7 presidency will be coherent with the necessity of implementing sustainable development goals. In particular, Italy intends to assume a leadership role in the environmental field, promoting the goals set at the Paris Agreement on climate changes and thus adopting the G7 plan toward the decarbonization of our economies by 2050. Picking up the trail of the recent Expo Milan 2015, Italy would like to guide the G7 toward the goal of ensuring, in particular for the poorest countries, food security and sustainable agricultural systems in several sub-Saharan African countries, but also to address the inequality, not only in terms of income, but also related to gender, ethnic background, access to healthcare, and education. The third pillar, innovation, skills, and jobs in the age of the next production revolution, will be focused on the importance of innovation as an instrument to relaunch the growth of advanced economies. However, innovation is happening within the framework of profound changes tied to the digital economy and automation, with consequent risk of disruption of certain competences and jobs. This process entails several actions and will mainly concentrate on the promotion of financial and legal rules able to promote the ICT and the spreading of new manufacturing models, in particular in favor of small and medium companies. Besides the priority listed on the three above mentioned pillars, the Italian presidency will treat other fundamental topics for the G7, such as the themes on global economy and international commerce. In this field, the Italian line will be to promote the adoption of fiscal and monetary policies in order to stimulate the growth of our advanced economies on the one hand, and on the other, to create consensus on the necessity to increase public investments in projects which have a long-term growth for the economy, as infrastructures and education. As far as the international business and trade, the Italian presidency will insist on the necessity to maintain alive the traditional messages for a greater liberalization of trade and against the rising of commercial barriers in an attempt to limit proliferation of bilateral agreements. These are the main themes we will face at the next G7 summit. Topics also from a transatlantic perspective, as we may witness contrast on important themes such as climate change, free trade, and immigration. The most revealing data of the present international situation points to a mistrust towards the institutions in our societies. A crisis which is a reaction to the imbalance created by globalization, the impact of new technology in all its forms, and the absence, for the time being, of a definitive outcome for the majority of the European countries of the 2007-2008 economic crisis. For this reason, I will say it again, the central theme will be to reconstitute and reinvigorate the lost confidence. Rebuilding the foundations for trust is indeed the Italian slogan, and it addresses not only the relationships among citizens and their government, but also relationships among leaders, many attending for the first time at G7. This is the most important effort for the Italian presidency, a challenge Italy takes on, armed with the fundamental values of liberty, democracy, and protection of human rights. And I am sure we will face the challenge to the best of our abilities, also with the help of your contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicola, very much, and we hope you'll be able to stay with us and be part of this. You know, the Greeks and Italians are very close. In fact, there's an old Italian expression, una faccia, one face, one race, we're all part of the same. And if you want to see the most beautifully preserved Greek temples in the world, go to the west coast of Sicily, to Agrigento. I'm there. It's sunset there, spectacular. So thank you, and needless to say, the Italian-American community has made great, great contributions here, and we're very proud of them. Apparently, as a result of time differences, we're not going to hear from our friends in Japan, so we're going to go right into our discussion. And say again? Well, I'm going to introduce it briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to the guy that put it together. But as you know, we've been working on this issue of cyber for some time. I have to tell you from a personal standpoint that I don't think the international community is spending anywhere near as much time on this as it ought to, given the potential consequences as well as the potential benefits, which John lays out in some detail in his paper. I'm not sure I know what fake news is, but maybe I will have some better sense of it by the time our session is over this morning. It strikes me that we've always had fake news in one form or another. I don't know whether this is a particularly new phenomenon, other than the fact that it's the way it's being transmitted. But principal concern here is to see if we can put together an impressive document and set of recommendations, which we can then present to the G7 at Taormina, hence the name of the plan. So without further ado, John, I'd like to have you come on up and whatever, and lay out the plan for us, and then we're going to have a couple of principal discussions, and then we're going to go to all of you and have a good solid discussion this morning. John Savage.
So the governor has been a little bit too generous in attributing this document to me. It's actually a digest, an abbreviation of the document that we prepared collectively, a group of us, last December. But it lays out, it describes a problem. The problem being that nations are assembling militaries to fight in cyberspace. They're developing new cyber weapons, and we're not sure how those are going to be used. They can be, if they're not controlled, there can be accidents that can occur, and this is a space in which it's possible for escalation to occur suddenly. And so because we don't understand these issues, there is a great risk associated with cyberspace. In particular, there are several scenarios that one can construct that illustrate how difficult things are. And I'm going to ask you a question. If I were to ask which of the two types of conflict you'd consider most dangerous, nuclear war or cyber war, I think many of us might say, well, nuclear war is going to certainly be more serious. Until you begin to reflect on the fact that nations are implanting malware into systems operated by other nations. And if you doubt that, read the latest version of the Department of Defense Law of War Manual, Chapter 16, page 995, and you'll see that they mention the pre-implantation of cyber weapons. That frightens the devil out of me, and it convinces me that there really isn't any important difference between cyber conflict and nuclear conflict. So how do we address this? Well, we need international cooperation. I don't think any nation has the solution. And how do we do this? Well, you know, we had a talk at Brown in my course on cybersecurity and international relations a week ago yesterday, who was the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber Issues. That's Vin Nguyen. He made the point that the period of peace that we've seen since the Second World War has been a product of two factors. One is the development of norms that states are willing to abide by, and the creation of institutions. So the world community, nations are actually assembling, and they are developing norms for cyberspace. And I want to highlight a couple that we have here that are not on the radar yet, but could be, that are in this document. And institutions. We don't have institutions. The question is, should there be institutions that some have proposed, and I'm trying to remember who proposed this, that we have an institution, it's Microsoft, who has proposed that we create an institution to help with the attribution of attacks. Who's done it? Now, a few years back, it was assumed that attribution was impossible. But we now know that there are some companies, CrowdStrike being one of them, the company that investigated the penetration of the Democratic National Committee computers, who within a few hours of the insertion of their software, monitoring software, into the DNC computers, they were able to say that there were 2 Russian hacking teams that were in that system. It turns out that there's more than one company. There are a handful of companies apparently who were good at this, and there are states who are good at this. And one of the measures, I'm part of a team working through the East-West Institute that's proposing some norms to the new Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, that one of the proposals that is on the table is to share information between companies who have the knowledge and governments on the basics of doing attribution. So a couple of things that we have got in this document that have not been discussed, I don't think, at the international level, are that nations should publicly identify classes of assets of their critical infrastructure. Identify those assets. Why? Because then you can say, look, there is this government group of experts, GGE norm, that applies to this. This is off limits to you. A second is the question of whether certain computer systems are so important that if you were to discover to your nation, if you would discover a foreign nation's software in there, you might say, this is very alarming. We may have to escalate here. And if in particular in your nuclear command and control center, you discovered the malware from another country, that may precipitate an escalation. So the question is, should this kind of implantation of malware be disallowed? A nation is going to have to agree on that if that's going to happen. But we are fortunate today to have 2 very distinguished speakers who are going to talk about this issue at length. The first is Mikko Hyppönen, who is the Chief Research Officer for F-Secure. He's going to speak for half an hour. And then Trey here, who is a cybersecurity fellow here at the Harvard Kennedy School, who will speak to us for 15 minutes. The floor is yours, Mikko. You're welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. My name is Mikko Hyppönen. I am the Chief Research Officer for a company called F-Secure, which is a computer security company headquartered in Helsinki, Finland. And I am a Finn myself, and I've spent the last 26 years tracking hackers, trying to understand where the attacks are coming from and what the motivations of the various actors out there are. And when I say I'm trying to track them, I mean I'm really trying to track exactly who they are. Like, who are these people? What's their names? Where do they live? How much money are they making? We do quite a bit of infiltration work inside F-Secure to find our ways inside different organized online crime groups, to find our ways to their discussion forums, to find our ways to their forums where they buy and sell stolen goods. And I've seen many surprises over my career in computer security. I always carry something to remind me of where I'm coming from. One of the first viruses I ever analyzed. Some of you might remember these, the USB thumb drive of its time. And this is what the enemy used to look like. I mean, this is what the attacks used to look like. This is how simple it was in late 1980s, early 1990s. Malware was not spreading on the net, it was spreading on floppies that we were physically carrying on us. Yet, even those early viruses did become a global problem. So one of the surprises I've had during my career was first realizing that those happy hackers who were writing viruses for fun started to make money with their malware. The organized online crime groups started forming, which was something we were sort of forecasting, but it still surprised us how quickly it happened when it started happening in the early 2000s, around 2003 or 2004. But even then, I really didn't see the next big shift, which was governments entering this game. Governments starting to write malwares, governments starting to do offensive hacking. For years and years, it seemed like science fiction. But as we all know today, it is not science fiction. It is very real, and it is escalating. In fact, I do believe we are right now seeing the beginning of the next arms race. We just got out of the last arms race. We're no longer every day worried about nuclear annihilation like we were in 70s and 80s. Of course, nuclear weapons still exist, but I believe the last arms race is behind us, and that lasted 60 years. And it might be that this is the next one, and this might last the next 60 years. But I do believe that we have no hope in trying to defend our networks if we don't understand who the hackers are. Many organizations, many individuals have a very cloudy view of who the hackers are. They think about these evil hackers who come from somewhere and do evil stuff for some reason, but they don't really think it through. And we have completely different kinds of groups, different kinds of actors targeting different targets for different purposes because they have different motivations. They use different techniques, which means you fight them with different technologies. So from my point of view, the crucial question really is, who are the hackers? And how are these actor groups changing as we go forward? So right now, today, I'm splitting hackers into 5 main groups. Let's see if this actually... So I'm splitting them into 5 main groups right now. And of course, this keeps on changing, but 5 main groups of hackers. First, here on the left, white hat hackers. This is Charlie Miller, this is Chris Valasek. They're both friends of mine, and they're both hackers. And you've heard of them, because these are the guys who hacked Chrysler Jeep vehicle systems in the summer of 2015, becoming front page news all over the world, because they were remotely over the internet able to take over passenger vehicles and drive them and accelerate them and disable the brakes and all kinds of scary things. But these are white hat hackers, so they didn't do that to drive people off the road. They didn't do that to steal people's money. They did that so they could tell Chrysler about the problems they found, so Chrysler could fix them. That's what white hat hackers do. And this is why companies run bug bounties, basically rewarding hackers with money when they find vulnerabilities in their systems. Google, Microsoft, and Apple are examples of companies which run bug bounties. We run a bug bounty. We actually invite hackers to try to break into our systems, and if they succeed, we pay them money. Why? Because when vulnerabilities are found from our systems, we want the hackers to tell us. We don't want them to tell someone else. In fact, we want them to sell that information to us. We don't want them to sell that information to someone else, potentially to our enemies. Group number 2, hacktivists or hacker activists. These guys do break the law, but they don't break the law for personal benefit. They're not trying to make money, or they might have a political motive. Anonymous, of course, is the best known example of hacktivist movements. But the lack of money making or trying to benefit personally makes them different from group number 3, which is criminals. Organized online crime groups trying to make money with botnets, with ransom trojans, with banking trojans, with keyloggers. And this group number 3, this is the biggest group by far. Vast majority of the attacks we see are coming from criminals. We receive on a typical day to our labs around 400,000 malware samples to be analyzed, which we collect automatically from all over the internet. We estimate that 98% of those 400,000 samples every day are coming from group number 3. That's how big it is. This is the biggest problem in numbers. But there's different kinds of ways of ranking seriousness, because group number 4 is governments. And of course, governmental attacks are much rarer. Much rarer, but when they hit you, they're much more serious. Because when criminals hit an organization, typically they weren't after that particular organization. They're after a victim. They don't really care who the victim is. So for example, credit card keyloggers, which are installed on corporate computers to collect credit cards as their numbers are being typed. The criminals don't care if the credit cards they collect are American credit cards or Canadian or Italian or Finnish. I mean, they just want credit cards. That's what they want. So these are very democratic attacks. They target everybody. But of course, the governmental attacks don't just target everybody. Not everybody becomes a target for a government. Many companies are worried about governmental attacks because these make the headlines. And these guys have the capabilities, the resources. They have the money. They have the 0 days. They have the skills. So these are scary problems. But organizations which were not being targeted by governmental attacks, for example, governmental espionage before the internet, didn't suddenly become a target just because of the internet. Very few organizations are being targeted. But of course, there are organizations which are being targeted. And then we have the last group, which is extremists or terrorists. And this is a problem which is still in the future. We have not seen cyber terrorism. Yes, we have seen terror groups which operate online. We see groups which recruit online, which communicate online, including communicate with encryption. But this is not really what we would call cyber terrorism, is it? Because this is exactly the same use of the internet as any other organization does for internet. Like every company recruits on the internet, every company communicates on the internet. So do these guys. But it's quite clear that especially Islamic State would like to be able to do more. They would like to be able to do cyber terrorism, or they would like to be able to support their real world attacks with online components, to expand their attacks to new domain, that is the cyber domain. And I did a fairly large study into the online capabilities of terrorist groups 5 years ago. I spoke about this at the RSA conference in San Francisco. And 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, the end result of my study was that while I was able to find examples of extremist groups which were using the internet, we didn't really have a problem at the time. And I did end my research with the statement saying that this, unfortunately, this problem is only going to get worse, not better. And that's exactly what has been happening over the last 5 years, especially with Islamic State. Islamic State is recruiting their expertise from the West. Many of their hacker skills are coming from different European countries. And the thing that seems to be limiting their capability to act right now seems to be US Army, which has so far launched 2 targeted drone strikes to kill hackers. And just saying that statement out loud sounds like something out of a science fiction book, doesn't it? US Army has launched drone strikes to kill hackers. True story, has happened twice now. Both of those Islamic State hackers who were killed in Syria in targeted strikes were UK citizens recruited by Islamic State from UK to move to Syria. And I spoke about one of those guys because we did a case study on one of those Islamic State hackers. He was one of the leaders at the time, because I was following this guy before he joined Islamic State, when he was still stationed in United Kingdom, where he was more like the guy here in group number 2. He was more like a hacktivist guy. At some stage, he started becoming radicalized. At some stage, he left UK and moved to Syria, changed his name, joined the Islamic State. And I did a case study on this guy and actually spoke about his career or his history in an event in Europe. And the interesting point about that thing was that that talk was videoed and posted to YouTube. And then the guy himself watched the video on YouTube. And then he started sending me messages, which is not nice when you know what these guys are capable of. But of course, this story does have a happy ending, which is that he's dead now, because he's one of the guys who was killed in those drone strikes. But Islamic State or other extremist groups is really worrying as source of cyber attacks, because when we look at these 5 groups, everyone else has a motive we can understand. Spies want to spy, criminals want to steal, hacktivists want to protest. So we can sort of forecast what kind of attacks they will be doing. But the attacks extremists and terrorists are making make no sense. The real world attacks make no sense. They're hard to understand. They're hard to forecast. For example, there's no other group here which would be, for example, interested in taking down the internet. Nobody wants to crash the internet. Criminals don't want to crash the internet. Why? Because they make their money on the internet. Hacktivists love the internet. Governments need the internet to do their attacks or to do espionage. The only party which really would like to kill the internet, if possible, would be extremists. So these guys are different from all the other ones. And we can hope that this problem is not going to become bigger than it already is. So these attacks done by criminals, they're all over the news. And they're very expensive. That's what we always hear. But how expensive? Like, how bad can it be? Well, there's a good example on just how expensive a cyber attack can become with the case of the Yahoo hack, which was in headlines 2 months ago. Because Yahoo lost over 1.2 billion user accounts and passwords from their systems. And what made this interesting was that this was in the middle of the acquisition process as they were being bought by Verizon. So Yahoo had to drop their price tag by $350 million. $350 million only because they were hacked. That's how much it can cost at an extreme. Which then creates the next question. Whose fault is this? Who did this to Yahoo? And the answer is this guy. It is Karim Baratov, a Russian citizen living in Toronto, actually right now in jail in Toronto, waiting extradition to the United States to be tried for hacking into Yahoo together with his partner in crime, Alexei, another Russian, who is in Russia at the moment. And don't get me wrong, not all the hackers are Russians, because some of them are from Ukraine. That is a joke. So Karim, one thing that we do when we investigate cases involving online organized crime groups is to try to find the online footprint of these people. And today, everybody is on Facebook. Even the criminals are on Facebook. So we're quite often able to find social media profiles of these online criminals. They might be having their profiles under different names or things like that, but they are online. And looking at their social media profile paints a picture. So for example, this is from Karim's Instagram. That's a picture of his car keys. 2 Mercedes, 1 Lambo, 1 Ferrari, and 1 Maserati. And here's a picture from his yard. That is a Rolls Royce. And they always say that crime doesn't pay. Here it does. But of course, like I just told you, he is no longer enjoying his car collection because he is in jail at the moment. So the amount of money moving in online crime is significant, and we see this easily when we follow the online movements of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin provide online criminals with anonymous money transfers, just like cash in the real world is the preferred way of moving money. For real world criminals, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies is the preferred way of moving money for online criminals. It also enabled trends like ransom attacks. This is a ransom Trojan. We're all familiar with this problem of an employee walking into our office Monday morning carrying his laptop to the office. Unfortunately, the laptop got infected at a airline lounge on Sunday. So the employee carries in a ransom Trojan, which then overnight will encrypt not only his laptop, but all the shares in the network drive that user can access. After which the Trojan demands a ransom payment if you want to get your own files back. And the ransom is always demanded in Bitcoin or in other cryptocurrencies, which of course doesn't mean that Bitcoin is bad, because it isn't bad, just like cash isn't bad. And I always travel with one Bitcoin. So if you've never seen a Bitcoin, a physical Bitcoin, I have one here. Let me put this around. Bitcoin's valuation, or the exchange rate to dollar today, is around $1,200. So I want to get that back afterwards. Right now I'm showing trust to you, right? Or actually it's for sale. If you want to buy it, it's for sale. Nevertheless, the mechanisms that online criminals use to make money online are very creative. I mean, the idea of taking people's own files as a hostage is fairly creative. I mean, the original idea on how many hackers make money is that they steal information and sell that information to the highest bidder. But when you steal information from, let's say, a home user, there's nothing worth selling. It's somebody's holiday photos and his email history. Nobody wants to buy that, except the user himself. That's the operating logic of ransom Trojans. They steal the information and sell it to the highest bidder. In this case, the highest bidder is the computer's owner himself. And if you actually go through and pay the ransom, they will deliver what they promise. You will get your files back. This has been tested many times by many unfortunate victims who did not have backups to recover from. Of course, we never recommend people to pay, but we know many do. And I suppose the most creative thing in ransom Trojans I've recently seen was in a Trojan we found in January, a ransom Trojan called Popcorn, which encrypts your files, wants 1 Bitcoin, so $1,200 to get your files back. However, if you don't have $1,200, let's say you're some home user and you just can't afford to pay $1,200 to get your files back, it will offer to give you your files back for free. It will give you your files back for free if you infect 2 of your friends. And this is a brilliant mechanism, isn't it? It's very creative. It's hard to be angry at these guys when they are so creative, because they are combining a pyramid scam with a ransom Trojan, or creating some kind of a chain letter effect into a ransom Trojan. But I suppose the most important developments over the last years have been with governmental action. I don't really like the word cyberwar. And the reason why I don't really like it is that it's way overused. Because every time there's anything happening anywhere in the world which is somehow linked to any government, the headlines will speak about cyberwar. First of all, I don't believe in cyberwar as a separate phenomenon. Cyber is a domain. It's yet another domain. Thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, we were already fighting wars with very primitive weapons, with our swords and our horses. And in the early days, we were only able to fight wars on land. We only had land war, because we weren't capable of fighting wars on the sea. But eventually we got the capability to fight wars on land and sea. And when the wars expanded to sea war, land war didn't go away. Then we had both land war and sea war. Typically, conflicts would involve both. And then we got planes. We got a new domain, air war. Then we got satellites and stuff, space war, and now cyberspace war. But no war is going to remove or leave old domains. They only expand to new domains. And cyber war is also a bad term for most attacks, because most attacks are not about waging war. Most governmental attacks are about stealing information. Most of the attacks that we analyze are about espionage. And espionage isn't war. Espionage is espionage. Spying is spying. War is war. And words matter. If something isn't war, it shouldn't be called a war. Because we will be needing this word for real examples of cyber war. Real cyber war, if you will. So why are governments so eager to do offensive attacks in the online world? Because cyber weapons are effective, affordable, and deniable. Effective, affordable, deniable. That's a great combination. That's a great combination in any weapon. And here we have a weapon which combines these features. So it's no wonder we are in a new arms race. And by the way, I believe that one of the things which is accelerating this arms race right now is, a little bit surprisingly, the leaks from Mr. Snowden. I don't think he realized this himself. And of course, he wasn't trying to accelerate the arms race. But what happened after his leaks is that many other governments were looking at the documents which were leaked. But holy hell, this is what the Americans are doing. We want to be doing this as well. Look at what they're doing. That's cool. We want to do that. We want to do that. And we are now in an accelerated arms race. One thing I'd really like to see would be Snowden's from Russia and China and from other superpowers. Where are they? So if deniability is one of the key properties of cyber weapons, how can we do attribution? Attribution was already referred to here earlier, that it is possible to do. It's hard, but it is possible to do. The very first governmental case that I worked with was in 2003, so 14 years ago. In that case, the victim was a European defense contractor, and after investigating the case for several weeks, we concluded that this is a governmental attack, and we believe it was launched from People's Liberation Army from China. That was 14 years ago. And during those years, we've investigated thousands and thousands of cases, governmental attacks from many, many different governments, including the Russians, including United States, including North Korea, including Iran. And there's much, much more out there. And I've coined a term for what I call the fog of cyber war. We've all heard of the term of fog of war. Well, there's also fog of cyber war. And it's a little bit different term, because in the real world, with traditional weapons, with many weapons, the power of the weapons is not in using them. The power of the weapons is in deterrence. Perfect example is nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have been used in a war 2 times. The whole rest of the power of nuclear weapons has been in deterrence. There are 11 countries on the planet which have nuclear weapons. We all know them. And when you know that a country has nuclear weapons, then you know not to mess with them because they have nuclear weapons. This is deterrence. But in cyber, we have no clue what are the capabilities of different countries. You can actually go and Google the amount of tanks Russia has, or the amount of aircraft carriers United States has, or the amount of warheads China has. You can get the exact count, but you will not be able to Google the cyber capabilities. And even though we know the biggest players, we know that USA is very good, we know Israel is very good, we know that China and Russia are very active. Beyond that, it becomes really, really cloudy, really, really quickly. So if the power of cyber weapons is not in deterrence, then the power of cyber weapons is in using them, so making it much more likely that they actually are being used. And one more thing which drives governments into using these weapons is that these weapons have a best before date or expiry date. They don't work forever, because many of these weapons rely on exploits which target vulnerabilities in software like our operating systems or our browsers, our applications. And those vulnerabilities will not stay there forever because systems change. Operating systems are upgraded. Bugs are found and fixed. So if you want to get value for your investment into cyber weapons, you can't wait. You have to use them. And this is, of course, a varying development. And if this arms race is in the very beginning, it's going to take decades before we get into real discussions about cyber disarmament or rules of law for cyber war, if you will. Maybe it's going to take quite a while. We'll see. I know there's already initiatives in building these. And there are easy things we could imagine that would make sense as rules of law for cyber war or rules of law for cyber weapons. An easy example, Stuxnet. Stuxnet had a kill date. We found Stuxnet in June 2010. It had been spreading already for 3 years by that time. Stuxnet ended all operations in June 2012. This was pre-programmed in the code from the beginning. Why? Because the authors of Stuxnet did not want to leave it spreading around the world forever. They knew that the operation they were working with is going to be over by June 2012. So it was pre-programmed to stop all operations. And this is something that I believe we probably should be regulating into cyber weapons or cyber in the rules of law for cyber war. That, you know, when you use cyber weapons, you must not let them continue operations forever. I think everybody would agree, everywhere would agree that that would be a good idea. Things like that. There are things that could be done, fairly simple things. So almost all of the cases, thousands of cases that we've analyzed over the years, governmental cases, are either espionage or sabotage. Espionage or sabotage. And espionage is the vast majority. Sabotage cases are rare, like Stuxnet was sabotage, it wasn't espionage. And then there is one outlier, one governmental case that I can name, which is not sabotage and which is not espionage. And that's the attack against the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is probably better known by the abbreviation SWIFT. Because the SWIFT attack was done by North Korea. And this attack was not about sabotage. It was not about espionage. It was about stealing money. And there are very few governments on this planet which are desperate enough to resort to stealing money from other governments. But this seems to be an example of that. Then again, North Korea has been printing fake US dollars for a decade already. So if you have a desperate government, it's no surprise they resort to things like this. And in the attacks against international banks which were using the SWIFT network for money transfers, the attackers actually tried stealing over 900, almost $1 billion. I went to Wikipedia to check what is the annual budget for the country of North Korea. Their annual budget is $4 billion. So $1 billion would be a quarter of their national budget. They succeeded in stealing around $90 million. Transactions actually failed or were stopped. So let's speak about attribution here. How can I say this is North Korea? Well, first of all, I'm not a government entity. I can say what I want. So I can say we believe this is North Korea. We believe beyond reasonable doubt. This is the case with almost every time we attribute a case to a Russian government or Chinese government. We are confident enough to say it out loud. We very rarely reach 100% certainty because deniability is one of the core principles. Out of those money transfers, majority of them, $72 million, was wired to this casino in Philippines, from where it was laundered and moved further. And the malware which was used to do the transfer encrypted the communication using this encryption key, this key right here. And when we saw this key in the code of the SWIFT Trojans, we realized that we had seen this key before. We had seen this key once before. We had seen it 2 years earlier. And this key had never been made public. So basically nobody knew the key except the original author of both of these Trojans. So there's a connection here between two different attacks. So what was the other attack from 2 years ago? Well, that was the Sony Pictures hack, where Sony Pictures was hacked by the government of North Korea because of the movie, The Interview, in which the dictator of North Korea is killed. Sorry for spoiling this to you if you haven't seen the movie, but he is killed in the movie. And when this happened, US government made a public statement immediately saying that this is North Korea. And many people, many experts were surprised. I was surprised by this statement. But how the hell do they know? Like, how can they be so sure? Because the deniability part is one of the core features of cyber attacks. 2 weeks later, New York Times had a breaking story in which they told the world how did the US government knew. They knew because US government had hacked the North Korean systems 2 years earlier, and they were watching the North Koreans do it. This is how you get 100% certainty, when you've actually in the systems and you're watching them do it, which of course changes the story from the North Koreans hacking a US Hollywood studio to a North Korea hacking a Hollywood studio, and US government knows because they hacked North Korea. So an example of what I would call attack in cyber war would be the attack against Prokarpatto Oblenergo, which is the largest electricity distribution company in Ukraine. And this is the power outage case, which has been in the news many times. But what makes this unique is that this attack, which came from Russia, which was hitting a critical infrastructure target in Ukraine, happened in the middle of a war. This actually is during a war, or at least a conflict. Of course, Russians don't call it a war, but when you go to another country's land and steal part of their land by force, I call it a war, okay? I think this is war. And in this particular case, the engineers operating the long-distance electricity grid of Ukraine lost control of the workstations that were controlling the backup power generators at the relays. And this happened on Christmas Eve 2015. And they lost control, and they were simply watching the attackers control their workstations and shut down power from 200,000 people. And in my book, this would be cyber war, because there was a war. And that makes it different from what we saw here during presidential elections, which was labeled as cyber war over and over again in different newspapers. Yes, Russia tried affecting the outcome of presidential elections in the biggest superpower on the planet. True story. That's not cyber war. That's not war. Because there's no war declared between Russia and the United States. Thank God there is no war. But it is a remarkable scenario. And when we look at the latest news from today, the same group that was behind one of the attacks against DNC has now been attributed as also targeting the systems of the French presidential candidate, Mr. Marconi. So let's hear it from the man himself. This is from an interview done by Bloomberg with President Putin in October, before US elections. During that interview, the Bloomberg journalist asks Putin the key question. Mr. Putin, who hacked the Democrats? And Putin answers, is that really important? Does it even matter who hacked it? The important thing is the content of the emails. There is no need to distract the public about who did it. There is no need to distract the public about who did it. Now, we've analyzed many Russian malware cases over the years. And frankly, I still remember the time when it used to be hackers who were causing havoc and who were releasing private information. Now it seems to be governments causing havoc and governments releasing private information. One thing we do when we analyze these cases is that when we are ready with our investigation, we publish our reports and we make them public, including the reports where we make the call that this is Russian government. Then when the report goes out, we watch with great interest how do these actors change their behavior. We put out a report about the group called Callisto 2 weeks ago. Last year, we put out a 70-page report on a group called Dukes. Both are linked to Russia. And it's very interesting to see when the report goes out, where most of the downloads of this report are coming from. A very big part of them are coming from Russia, from Russian IP addresses. And in our reports, we list their servers, their IP addresses, their infrastructure, their encryption keys, their malware hashes, and then we watch how are they going to change the operation, because now this is public. And in some cases, they haven't changed their operations at all. They continue operations as if nothing would have happened. They go back to the office next morning and continue attacks with the same malware, with the same servers, with the same encryption keys, which tells us that these guys are not worried about getting caught. These guys are not worried about the cops coming to their doors. Why? Because they are the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk. And Governor Dukakis? Right.
Morning, everybody. Thank you again for the invitation. Mikko's done a nice job talking about how we describe the space, what cybersecurity looks like, what cyberwar is, or I think I agree, more importantly, is not. I want to talk a little bit more directly to the goals of this group, how we govern the space, how we set rules and limitations for the space. Because I think that the underlying thesis that we've started to hear this morning is true. States are playing an increasingly aggressive and important role in building not only the capabilities, the offensive capabilities that we see being deployed against computer systems, against hospitals, against databases, against eBay, but also in setting the rules of the road for behavior in this environment. So a couple of quick things at the top. How we describe the space matters a great deal. You've already heard a lot about what is in cyber war, but I also want to contend you that we know very little about what is a cyber weapon. Right? There are very few pieces of code, destruction, or direct harm to life and limb. Part of that is a function of the space. We haven't been putting computers on things that would directly imperil humans' lives for a long time. That's starting to change. Mikko brought up Chris Valasek. This group, right, these two individuals that are hacking automotive software, enables the potential for your brakes to fail, for your accelerator to race away from you, for control to be ripped from you as you're driving down the road, the potential for harm to life and limb from a piece of code. That's something we're going to see as an expanding factor in the next 10 to 15 years, absolutely. But a bigger piece of the puzzle isn't necessarily how I break physical equipment or how I destroy a life or cause harm to a person. A bigger factor is, how do I trust the systems that I'm waking up with and using every day? The data that I have access to as I go to the bank, or I go to the supermarket, or I run a global international financial system, right? Swift is a great example of this. The theft of data is interesting, but the potential threat to the trust that I have in that data, that it actually represents today what I thought it did yesterday, is as big a factor. So how do we trust the systems that we use, the data that we have access to? The internet is this wonderfully complex architecture. We've talked about this from time immemorial. It has all of these wonderful features. It's distributed. We don't have to trust single large parties with our data, with access to communications. People can innovate and spread information around the web. But realistically, that activity and all of those interactions are premised on a basis of trust. When I go to a website, that website is who it represents to be. When I communicate with someone and I exchange sensitive data with them, they are who they represent to be. When I give someone a file that purports to be a program, a Word document, or an internet browser, it is what I say it is. It is what it purports to be. The activities that have been described here have been attacking this architecture of trust for decades, right? This is the notion of a vulnerability in a system is my ability to do something to it that the designer didn't intend, take advantage of a poorly designed feature, find a very cleverly hidden flaw, and use that to manipulate the system to my own ends. So we come back to this issue of trust. As we describe the space and as we attempt to govern it, how do we improve this ecosystem of trust between actors? I want to make four sort of key points for you guys today. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to kind of run these home. The first is that one of the principal determinants of what can harm trust in this space is information. Do I know about that flaw in your software? Can I take advantage of it? When we talk about this relationship between states and non-states, a key factor is that both groups are learning from each other. We don't have a traditional split as we do in conventional weapons, where what states are doing tends to be vastly more sophisticated, vastly more complex, and vastly more capable than what non-state groups are capable of. Part of the reason for this is because we see this continual flow of information out of governments. Stuxnet's a great example. Stuxnet wasn't published on the cover of the New York Times, at least by the US government, right? And while people may be carrying copies of it around in their pocket now at Harvard, almost certainly today, Stuxnet was intended to be a secret weapon system, and yet it got out into the wild. It's in the public domain. All of the groups that we saw mentioned this morning, right, have access to that code and can take bits and pieces of it and learn from it and innovate in their own tools. So we come to this central idea. Innovation is key. Innovation is central to the process of attack and defense. Defenders get better, attackers improve. They find new holes, new vulnerabilities, new flaws, new opportunities to break into systems and cause havoc. Defenders improve again, and this process continues. So the first point I want to make for you is because this information is so key, it's important that we understand information flows in all directions. Governments learn and innovate based on what they see non-state actors and criminal groups doing. Criminal groups learn and innovate from what they see states doing. We don't have the stark dichotomization as we did with nuclear weapons, where there were very few countries that had access to these tools at the beginning of the nuclear arms race. Very few to no non-state groups that had any understanding of the technology underlying these weapons. Second, cyber isn't a domain necessarily. It sits on top of all these other domains. When I talk about land, sea, space, and air. What's important for us, though, in governing the activities of cybersecurity and governing cyberspace is trying to understand that the impact that I have with a piece of code can carry beyond just a computer system. When we talk about cyber conflict and we limit it to this one domain, we minimize its consequences. The piece of code that gave this Russian intelligence organization access to the Democratic National Campaign headquarters had a direct impact. It gave them access to this system, but the consequences of the release of the resulting information were far greater than just having broken into that system. When we think about conflict, we think about cybersecurity as a single domain problem, we minimize that potential impact. So it's critical for us to understand how it sits in each of these domains. There's and I know Miko knows about these guys, there's a common Turla. It's a piece of Russian espionage software. It's been around for an extended period of time. And they have this group that builds and operates this code, a penchant for using compromised satellite communication systems to communicate with victims. What this tells us is not necessarily, we don't have to get into the tactics and procedures of this particular group that they like to use satellites to exfiltrate, to steal data from their targets, but that the satellite systems in this case are vulnerable. So the computer systems we think about when we talk about cybersecurity are your laptops and your cell phones, your headphones. That's fair, these are a big piece of the puzzle. But then we start to look around the room and we see the microphones, we see the cameras, and we look around and we think about the broader telecommunication system and its vulnerabilities. We realize that cyberspace is really not constrained in any distinct way to a small set of devices, to a small piece of the communications puzzle. We have to think about it as a much broader piece. As we go forward the next 10 to 15 years, and we begin to attach devices that can compute and can connect to your toaster and to your cars and to the wheels on your cars and to pieces of you and medical devices and to pieces of your house, right, to tell you things like the temperature and to track movement. The information from these devices and the potential vulnerability that they pose becomes that much greater. So to say cyberspace is all around us may be trite, but it's increasingly true, literally and figuratively on the walls in this room. Third point I want to make is this is not the wild, wild west. This is an important idea for the G7, but also for these sorts of normative activities when we're talking about setting rules of the road. There's very little in this space that is ungoverned already. We like to think about it as being the wild, wild west because there are all these attack and defense activities going on. There are groups that can build capabilities in their basement and deploy them against significant political parties the next day. Right? The mythical 400-pound hacker is a myth, but the generative idea behind that is not. Individuals have access to these capabilities in this space, can build sophisticated malware, can do a great deal of damage, a great deal of good, all on their own. There's nothing that limits that. But the activities that they exist in, because we see this, don't mean that the space is ungoverned, that there are no rules. There are a panoply of organizations that set technical standards, that govern the behavior of these networks, that observe and monitor and maintain the health of these systems that we're talking about. They've been around for decades, far longer than we've been talking about this problem. So to propose that we govern a space that's ungoverned forces us to act in a way that is at odds with reality. There's two costs to this. First, it potentially creates a great deal of friction with these communities that already exist, right? And as I think most of you would know, walking into a room that has a number of issue area experts working on a problem and pretending that they've done nothing interesting, that they're all morons, and that you have the solution to the problem they've been working feverishly to solve is potentially a recipe for disaster. So this is issue one, the friction that this creates. Issue two, though, is there may be problems that we don't necessarily have to solve, or there may be problems that don't manifest in the way that we see so immediately. So I'll give you an example. In 2013, there was a multilateral arms control arrangement called the Wassenaar Arrangement. It's created in 1996 as a way for states to coordinate their export control laws. I'm going to block a certain type of high-strength metal from being sold around the world because I think it could be used in missile parts. I, the United States, don't want someone who's going to buy that to simply go to Canada and get the same piece of equipment. So I coordinate with Canada, with the French, with the Germans, with the UK, with the Italian government, and we craft a set of laws that are common and comprehensive. Wassenaar is the tool to do this. In 2013, Wassenaar added malicious software, components of malicious software, to its list of controlled items. Over the next 2 years, almost all of the Wassenaar members attempted to implement these controls in their domestic laws. And then it was the United States' turn. So the Department of Commerce, which is the controlling agency for these laws, issued a set of proposed rules and requested notice and comment, allowing individuals to come and comment on the rules and give feedback. And there was a firestorm of criticism. What Commerce and many of the delegates at Wassenaar hadn't considered was the impact that these rules, as written, would have on the defensive community, on the sorts of vulnerabilities that we're talking about in systems being shared between researchers, talking about how to create defenses for them, innovating against attackers. Suddenly, this institution presumed that there was an ungoverned space, dropped a set of rules into it, and created a tremendous amount of blowback from the community that was already in that space. So it was attempting to marshal these forces of good and evil. The Wassenaar Arrangement is part of a continuing conversation and dialogue between the United States and other member countries, but it's kicked up a tremendous amount of criticism and in some cases goodwill, so it's created some engagement between these communities of defenders and politicians. So there are institutions in this space. We can't approach it like it's the Wild Wild West. There's governance that's happening. So how do we tailor the types of governance activities we're most interested in to approach the problems we find are most important? And this is my third point. I'll come back to this fourth point, excuse me. Come back to the original idea of trust. The activities of governments that we care most about restricting, ours as well as those of our opponents and potential allies, are those which impact the architecture of trust underneath the internet. The compromise of SWIFT is interesting, but the compromise of an international clearinghouse and banking network, and the presumption now of users who go to rely on that network, potentially not trusting it, has far greater impact than just $81 million stolen. When I log onto my computer, when I have my cell phone, the activities that I take on that device presume that the individuals that I'm interacting with and the content that I'm seeing is what it purports to be. Malicious software and government espionage activities that attack that trust architecture, that take sites and misrepresent them, or create fake images. So I'll give you an example. China has been successful at least twice in replicating the Google homepage in order to suck in users of Google Mail, right, often Tibetan activists and political dissidents, to steal their passwords and credential information, to get into their email accounts and begin to spread through the rest of their digital lives. China's able to do this was in two cases because they were able to compromise something called certificate infrastructure that Google uses. Basically, Google has a tag associated with its page that says, I am Google, this is my information, and here's how you can trust and verify that it is actually me. So I connected that page and we create an encrypted tunnel between those two links. China was able to create fake certificates for this Google page and steal information from these users. That sort of trust infrastructure, that compromise of that trust infrastructure, undermines our ability to use the web, undermines the sort of innovation that we see in defensive communities and cybersecurity, as well as this economic engine of growth that has been the internet in the last 15 to 20 years. So as we're thinking about what rules we could set, remembering again that this wild, wild west idea is something of a fiction, right? That there are often rules and existing governance activities. I would propose to you that in thinking about the behaviors you want to shape, one of the key issues is governing how we impact this trust architecture. Two ways to do this, right? I'm thinking about your proposal. The first, positive requirements, right? Not trying to restrict behavior, but trying to compel behavior from states. We had a great discussion. I was fortunate enough to participate in one of the preparatory workshops for the group of government experts last year. And one of the big questions that's come up is trying to understand how this group of governments compels behavior from the private sector. Right? It goes without saying that the networks, the devices, the architectures we're talking about are almost entirely owned by the private sector. Right? This is not a government-dominated space. So they're asking this question of how do they cooperate with these groups? There is a difference, and as a strategy, from requiring that a country not do something, from going to ask that a country do something. So one of the proposals that we're working on, I have no official knowledge of whether or not it's going to be in the actual GGE report when it comes out. But one of the proposals that had been discussed at the time in May was the idea that GGE no longer approach simply requiring states not to do things, but ask states to encourage public-private cooperation, to look at building trust between the private sector and governments, where there was mistrust to facilitate communication and information sharing. This is a complement to the more traditional role for these sorts of norms in encouraging and banning behavior or in trying to block or shape behavior. So as you're going through and thinking about these requirements, thinking about this trust architecture, how do you find a way to both compel positive behavior, cooperation between the public and private sectors, while also shaping these more potentially threatening or hostile behaviors? One closing note. When we're thinking about cybersecurity and conflict, one of the most important ideas is that the space is changing. It goes without saying to some extent, but I'll say it anyway. The space is mutable. It shifts underneath us. We can manipulate it. What that means is not necessarily that our efforts now, which may be put into practice 5 years from now, are for naught, but rather that we have to understand what truly matters in this landscape. Trying to cooperate with a particular company, trying to target a particular type of software, these are time-limited behaviors, right? The way governments are innovating with the way that they write code is tremendous. In the last 5 years, it's changed radically. Where they go into computer systems, how they live on those systems, what they do when they're there has shifted. But there are underlying behaviors, right? Knowing that everyone has access to a great deal of the information in this space, I can learn from you on Twitter some of the latest and greatest vulnerabilities in software systems. I don't have to go and necessarily purchase something from a vendor, although I can also and pay a great deal of money to do so. Understanding that this information flows in all directions and is accessible to almost all parties. Do we find ways to restrict that information flow, or do we encourage it? And like when we're talking about bug bounties, try to direct it to where it could be most valuable. Right? Wassenaar's fundamental failing wasn't that it tried to restrict malware necessarily, but that it tried to limit this information flow in a way that was very carefully prescribed and did a bad job of it. A better way to approach this problem would be to ask, not how can I keep potentially malware out of the hands of malicious actors, but how can I take this information that's useful to defenders and bring it more readily to them, more rapidly, more effectively? How can I improve their ability to use it? How do I make innovation in defense more effective and more rapid than innovation in attack? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, we've got a fair amount of time now for discussion. Maybe we ought to start with some comments, John, from you as a result of what you've heard. And obviously our focus here, folks, is to see how this is relevant to recommendations that we hope we'll be able to make to the G7 for some degree of international agreement, discussion, or more. So, John, some thoughts.
Okay. Perhaps I can sit here. Do you have a microphone? Can we use
I
this?
think we have mics, don't we?
Oh, we sure do.
Hello?
Yeah. Well, I want to thank the speakers. They both did a very fine job. To be honest with you, I've said a lot already. I would, but I do think that a couple of the points that have been made here, by example, if not directly, are worth repeating and acknowledging. First is that the private sector, as illustrated by Miko and F-Secure, have an understanding in depth of the cybersecurity challenge. and governments should be sharing it, should be working with the private sector to get the private sector to give them information they don't have. This is a point also that Trey has made, and I think that's very important. I would like to also highlight the role that Microsoft has played. Back in 2015, they began developing norms that they would like to see states follow, and they have enhanced those norms with a publication last year in which they, in addition to offering advice to the state, making requests basically to states, they have also offered advice that their fellow ICT companies can accept to make their systems more secure. I would love to see governments share information. An example that I find very interesting is that the person who's now the current cybersecurity coordinator for the United States government, his name is Rob Joyce. He used to be head of the Tailored Access Operations Department at the National Security Agency. And in January of 2016, he gave a public address at a conference run by the USNIX, USCNIX organization, a conference called Enigma. And he got up and said something to the effect, which you can see on the YouTube video, that he was a little uncomfortable giving this speech because it's not normally how he spends his time, but he said, I'm here to give you some tips on how to protect yourself from departments such as mine, organizations such as mine. And the concept of sharing important information that others can use to elevate the level of security, I think is a wonderful one. So what this illustrates for me, with the previous comments you've heard, are that there is a need for genuine sharing of some detailed information between the private sector and the public sector. Let me add to that an issue that came up in a conversation. This is the attribution problem. As I said before, I believe that if when companies have good understanding of how to do effective attribution, which some do, they could explain that to us. And I'll give you an example, illustrate this with an example. There is one company, CrowdStrike, I know, that will, if you buy their service, will in effect put malware into your operating system. It's a plugin. And what does the malware do? It reports the activity that it sees from the vantage point of the operating system back to their cloud that the CrowdStrike company operates. And then they analyze the behavior that their software is observing in the client's computer system and comparing it against what is considered to be normal activity. Just illustrate it this way to make it really concrete. When I'm sitting at my computer and working, the question is, how many files do I open in an hour? Would you say 1,000? So if you observe that 1,000 files are being opened and closed, you should assume that you're being hit with a ransomware attack, because that's how you encrypt all the files. You have to first open the file, encrypt it, and then write it back. So again, I would like to emphasize that this is a global problem that requires a global solution. I have one more dimension to this, just to illustrate that the cooperation between states is not only possible, but has happened. That's illustrated by the agreement between the United States and China in September 2015 when the two presidents met. And what they did is they, among other things, agreed to cooperate, set up a mechanism of cooperation. But in addition to that, what they said is neither country should steal intellectual property for commercial purposes from the other. And both FireEye, which is a major forensics company, and CrowdStrike has observed a dramatic reduction in the amount of theft of intellectual property for commercial purposes. The head of the CTO of Dmitry Alpitovich of CrowdStrike said it's been 90% reduction. Why did they do that? I'm not sure. You have to ask, why did the Chinese agree to this? And I think it wasn't solely because the President of the United States put pressure on them. I think it's because the major Chinese internet companies, and 4 of the largest are Chinese, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and others, they were complaining to their government that their intellectual property was being stolen. And you, just to put that one more word on this, put that in the American context, how many of you have heard of the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island? It's just 40 miles south of here. Okay, Slater Mill. Pawtucket is the town contiguous with Providence, where I live, which is the capital of the state of Rhode Island. Samuel Slater was discovered by Moses Brown. Moses Brown and his brother John Brown gave Rhode Island College $5,000 to change its name from Rhode Island College to Brown College. It's now Brown University, my employer. And Moses Brown was trying to put up a textile mill in the town of Pawtucket on a river. He couldn't get it to work, put an ad in the newspaper in New York City, discovered Samuel Slater, who had left England in disguise, because the law at the time said, if you have knowledge of the textile industry, we can't afford to lose these secrets, so you can't leave. And you can't sell parts. Well, Samuel Slater was discovered, came to Rhode Island, got the mill to work, put up 30 more of his own. He's now called the father of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Okay, so, okay, great. So the point is, we have an awful lot to learn, and let's hope we can do it together.
Great. Council General?
You've got a mic right there. Why don't you say, why don't you all say it? We'll pass it on. Any comments about this as we look at Taravina? Is there going to be some discussion of this going on? Should there be? What do you think?
Well, I do believe that definitely there will be. I was recently reading an interview of Minister Internato, Frank Internato from the Italian Foreign Office, who was just talking about this issue about cyberwar and cybersecurity. So it is a thing that will be developed during the G7. And as you were saying, I think that we need more norms and rules about these issues, which are not well known from the general public. But definitely, if we look what we want from the G7, what we want from politics, is a vision, is shaping a vision. And I believe that your report will be very instrumental for that. So I will transmit it to my ministry, and I'm sure we'll have a very important follow-up on it.
Like all of you to contribute to this, and I've asked the same question I asked the last time we had the discussion. Who's working on this right now in a kind of international capacity? Is anybody at the UN working on this? Is anybody, Trey, what's going on out there?
So this is being taken up in a number of forums. G7 is obviously one of them, but the principal group, which you guys have already mentioned, is the group of government experts, which has been meeting for several cycles, year cycles, is meeting now, and we'll try to issue a consensus report at the end of this year. But part of the issue, the challenge has been that a lot of the normative development has happened in very specific context. The Holland Manual, which was put together at NATO's CCD Cybersecurity, so the Cybersecurity Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia. It deals with the application of international law, has opened up a lot of this normative discussion. GGE has hit some very big issues, but there's difficulty in making progress because there's a disparate set of communities of interest. And so the question now is, are we going to start to see the norms process fragment into smaller and more sort of substantive areas? But that's sort of TBD.
Does the U.S. government have a policy at this point?
Yes.
And what is it?
Well, the U.S., through the cybersecurity coordinator in the State Department, is active in all of these forums. The GGE is one where they've had 5 committees were appointed. These are multi-state committees. The last one had 20 states represented. The current one, I don't know how many there are. Do you know how many?
30 plus.
30 plus. This current one is not expected to produce much, but the norm of not to steal intellectual property for commercial purposes, came out of the GGE process. You have what's called the London process started by the foreign minister of the UK. It's led to meetings every year that have been held in state governments around Europe. You have the UN back in the early 2000s created the World, what's called the World Symposium or on the Information Society, brought nations together to start this process. The Russians, going back to 1998, were proposing a cyber arms treaty in the first committee of the UN. That was poo-pooed by the United States. They didn't want to pursue it, but it did lead to a whole series of other meetings. There is an organization called the Internet Governance Forum that meets every year, and it brings up to 1,500 representatives of governments and private sector. There is a new process that was just started this year in the Netherlands, which is announced at the Munich Security Conference, which is called the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. That's going to be located in the Netherlands. It has something like 30 different people who are commissioners of this organization. The East-West Institute, which is based in New York City, with which I have an affiliation, is serving as one of the two secretariats for this body. So that's keeping the London process going. There was a commission called the Bild Commission for this foreign minister of Sweden. It's organized by the Brits and the Canadians. That is now concluded, but there is a number of efforts that are continuing. So I think we have a lot to be thankful for.
Okay, comments, reactions, yeah.
Governor, I would just add too, from the U.S. perspective, there are dozens of strategies that the federal government has produced since late 90s, but largely it reflects, I think, a country's culture. And so in the U.S., for example, when it comes to cybersecurity, the .gov domain is monitored, protected by the Department of Homeland Security. .mil is the Defense Department, but we all sort of live and work in .com. And that very much reflects our laissez-faire approach to the economy. And if 90 or more % of the internet is in private hands, that means largely it's a civilian space, and companies and individuals prefer that. Very different than the Russian approach, where all the servers and telecoms are subject to government monitoring. Very different from the Chinese approach, attempting anyway to sort of erect the great firewall and to control information. So no shortage of ideas, but I mean, I'd almost like to pull on the punchline a little bit that Nico sort of offered towards the end of it, and I thought it was fantastic, that you don't see the change in their signatures or encryption keys because these organizations have the protection of their governments. And so I'd be curious maybe if we can sort of dwell a little bit on that and maybe put it in a larger context where I think we're approaching this from a Western perspective. And I'm a professor at a war college, and I sort of take the Western view. War is a continuation of politics. There should be violence involved, but I also read Sun Tzu, which also says to be victorious without firing a shot is also war. And so a country used the China examples, which I appreciate. So I don't know how you might sort of pull that thread a little bit to see, are Western governments fundamentally incapable of thinking through this problem, where you look at your example with Russia or China, and their just outlook and approach to cyber is very different.
Oh, what do you think?
Indeed, there are different worlds out there, and the policies by the governments of, for example, Russia and China are quite different from the policies of European countries or the United States as it comes to working with online criminals to do the government's dirty laundry. And we see examples of this happening regularly. Around 6 years ago, I made a public plea for Russian law enforcement authorities to take a gripper hand on Russian criminals, because we over and over again were seeing cases where investigating Russian criminals. We had all the evidence packed, so we provided them with everything, and they did nothing because there were no local victims. I mean, the local Russian criminals knew this. They were avoiding victims inside Russia because then they knew that the Russian law enforcement wouldn't care. they actually saw as a standard feature in malware of the time was that the very first thing it would do when it would infect a new computer is that it would check the keyboard layout. If the layout is Cyrillic, it does nothing, which means that it won't run in Russian or Ukrainian or Bulgarian computers at all. I'm happy to report that that problem did get solved. At some stage, Russian law enforcement authorities started to get a much better grip on Russian online criminals, even when they had no local victims, even when the victims were only outside of Russia. There were many, for some banking Trojan cans taken down by Russian law enforcement without local victims, which was great. However, then there were these individuals which for some reason were not taken down. And as we learned later on, is that they turned out to be too useful for the government. And useful? Too useful. Useful, yes. So they were, they had, for example, large botnets where a significant amount of the infected devices were in US networks, even private networks or governmental networks, providing a window for espionage purposes into certain networks. And those guys seem to be protected, and we don't see Western governments doing that. We don't see, for example, US government working with American online criminals to do this. And it's a different viewpoint, and it's very good to keep in mind.
Other thoughts, comments, reactions?
Can I ask a question about the SWIFT attack, the Bangladesh caper? Has any government entity attributed publicly the SWIFT attack through Bangladesh and the Philippines to the North Koreans, or is that something that's privately figured out?
Everybody who's worked with the case agreed that it seems to be North Koreans. I haven't seen any government blurt it out like I blurted it out here. Like I said, if you believe that some pictures was North Korea, and it seems to be North Korea, we have in my book, very strong evidence linking the same actor to the SWIFT case.
But didn't that, as I recall, all the things that were involved in that, it was like an Ocean's 11 caper. You know, there was a printer that was disabled, and there were people on the ground in Bangladesh that must have surveilled the bank and people at the casino in the Philippines and picked up the money and took it to places. Is there any evidence to suggest that North Korean actors were involved on the ground someplace in those countries that are not particularly well policed?
Yes, there is. There are North Korean actors who were operating from a hotel in Singapore during this operation. As far as, I actually don't know their whereabouts right now. I'm not even sure if any of them were arrested at the time. It was later on proved when the IP agencies, or IP traffic was analyzed that the actual attack wasn't coming from North Korea physically, because the actors weren't physically in North Korea when this was going down. And the link to the Philippines casino is interesting. We believe that the money laundering was done in poker tables, because poker is the only casino game where when you lose, the money doesn't go to the casino, it goes to the other players at the same table. So it's an easy way of moving money from one player to another player. So we see both real-world casinos and virtual casinos used for money laundering purposes, and almost always done with poker. Thanks, Colton.
Right.
Well, I was just going to say, if that Ocean's 11 caper story is true, that's most certainly a state actor anyway. Even ones such as, of course, North Korea, because you don't see non-states able to do something like that.
It's more outrageous, really, than an Ocean's 11 plot.
Yeah. Oh, I got the mic.
You got the mic. Any thoughts more broadly about?
Well, what I was thinking is, okay, we want international norms, we want international cooperation. It seems that China's been behaving more than it used to, and that's a good thing. Maybe attributed to the G-Obama meeting. But now it looks like the Russians are the ones willing and able to do the things that they're doing, as we're seeing here in the French elections as well, and maybe Merkel's going to be the next person after the French elections. So how do we handle the Russians?
Tell us what they're doing in the French elections.
Well, they're doing basically the same. They're trying to do the same thing that they did to the DNC. They're trying to get into Macron's private server, private emails, to be able to find some dirt on him to prop up a pen, if that's what they want. I mean, Le Pen's been more pro-Russian than Trump ever was during the campaign. She goes to Moscow all the time to say hi to Putin and try to get some rubles, I guess, right? So, and then we have the German elections in September, I believe, which they seem pretty safe right now. I don't see the fringe groups really gaining steam, but Le Pen, they're not giving her a chance, but you know, they also did not give Brexit or Trump a chance, so we shall see. So that's what I'm saying is this information warfare. We need to start kind of combining with the cyber.
One note on elections I'd like to make. I do believe what happened with the US elections is what's going to look like in the future. Like every major important election will have some cyber element into it. Not every election will, but every important one will. And whether it is trying to affect the opinions of voters through micro-targeted messages on social media, or whether it's actual hacking, especially in countries which do voting online or digital voting. Some countries do that, which is a bad idea, in my book. Nevertheless, what I found as a real eye-opener to me was when I was in Mexico City in January. Mexico has presidential elections coming up in 16 or 15 months. And this was right after US elections, so they were, it was a really hot topic, and they were really, really worried about their presidential elections being hacked. And they were not worried about the Russians or about any other government. They were worried about the cartels. And this is a real eye-opener. Like when you have the money, you can buy the skills to try to hack an election. And of course, the drug wars who definitely like to elect a Mexican president, which would be good for them.
I'd like to make a couple of points about elections. The first is that in many jurisdictions, we use electronic machines, electronic voting machines. And I'm affiliated with the Verified Voting Foundation, which is an organization that worries about the use of electronic voting machines. They can be hacked, they have been hacked. There was an example of a jurisdiction, I think in the state of Maryland, that put their computer system out there, their voting system out there to see if it could be hacked. And there is a fellow in faculty at the University of Michigan, whose name escapes me at the moment, whose team broke in. The thing that's interesting about so the first point I'd make is we really, if we're going to be using electronic voting machines, we should be thinking very hard about what standards they should meet. Right now, companies will say, listen, take it or leave it. We have copyrighted software. We're not going to give the state that's acquiring these machines the right to read the software because you can violate our copyrights. But there seems to me that the security of the vote needs to have a higher priority, so states should be demanding that. The second question I raised that I think everybody can contribute to is this. Did the Russians go too far in meddling with the US elections? I think the general consensus is no, they engaged in an influence campaign, but with one proviso I mentioned in a minute. But consider the scenario that they actually altered the vote outcome. That would be very, I think it should be considered very, very seriously. Would the public accept that? I don't know. I think because they're likely to say it's just happening, it's not that important. But there is this general issue of which voting is a part, which is what constitutes violence in cyberspace? Are there things that you can do through cyber means that would have such an effect on people, violation of humanitarian law, that you might say that's an example of cyber or virtual violence? There's a young man at Yale who's written on this subject and raised the issue, and I think it ought to be debated.
For a second, please. So I want to make the point. I think it's important to draw a distinction between compromising elections infrastructure, and there's a great piece on this by Dr. Michael Solmeyer and Ben Buchanan over at the Belfer Center back from October, and it describes the potential vulnerabilities in vote tabulation, vote recording systems. But there is a very big difference between that and the sort of influence operations that we were talking about with regard to the Russians and their attempts to undermine confidence in and potentially alter the outcome of the US election, the French and German elections, potentially the snap election in the UK. And the reason that distinction matters is more than technical. It's also that the measures we may take to defend or build resilience against them are very different. And the influence operations that we're seeing are as much a product of existing fissures in society. They are exploiting ideological differences and social distinctions as much as they are anything technical. And so the response we may have to that is massively different than a very valuable topic of how to build cryptographically secure and high integrity voting systems.
About a month ago, I was in New
Let
York.
me just say, look, as a guy who's run for office several times, it strikes me that when it comes to the counting of the votes, the integrity of that, we've got to deal with that fast. And if it means going back to voting machines or even paper ballots, that's fine by me. Seriously. I mean, it's just anything that might compromise the integrity of the tally seems to be just unthinkable, unacceptable. And it seems to me it's an easy way to get off of. Go back to something that can't be hacked, that isn't electronic. Question of what all this is doing to the debate result. I mean, it's going to be interesting to look at this French thing. Now that we've got two candidates, and most of us would think that she really doesn't have much of a chance at this point. And I think that's at least something we ought to watch very, very carefully. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yes, sir, thank you.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Tom Freely from Naval War College.
Great.
BGF and technology there. Pleasure to be here. Several weeks ago, I was in New York at the conference board, and which I represent the Navy there.
Why don't you just hold that mic up a little closer to you?
The discussion goes back to what John just mentioned about culture and ideology. Corporations are now experiencing the cyber culture that is competing with the organizational culture. And they are now getting in their discussion, how do we begin to deal with this? Because it deals on the level of ethics. And you see a different ethic coming in from the cyber culture into the organizational culture, which broadly affects the ideological, political, and economic aspects of it. So I guess the question I would have for John or anyone else here, how much are we, I know we've talked a lot about governments and policy with government, but how much are we including in getting the or the opinions of the corporations that are dealing with this on a global level?
Well, you know, they're in the Clinton administration, they were taking the critical infrastructure very seriously, and somebody invented the concept of information, ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers, and now I'm using the term information sharing and analysis corporations. The financial community was the first to come forward because they deal with international finance issues and are worried about security and loss of funds. And they made a lot of progress. When you join an ISAC, you sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep information confidential and not try to hire other people who are representing other companies in these organizations. The electricity industry set up a ISAC a couple of years ago. These organizations, there's also an international body called FIRST. Do you remember what the acronym stands for? It's an international organization to which these computer emergency response teams, all through which they will coordinate. So you've got a number of venues like that. In the internet governance space, when countries and parties come together, they do this through the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers and other organizations. People talk about multi-stakeholder governance. That it means you bring in all the stakeholders who have an interest in a topic to discuss it. This competes with multilateral organizations where only states come together to discuss issues. I'll give you an example, the International Telecommunications Union, created in 1865, based in Geneva, which was created to handle standards for interconnectivity and payments for long distance calls for telecommunications companies. It played a very important role back prior to 2012. The member states, and every UN nation is a member, they were trying to use that vehicle to take over control of the internet governance. They approached the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the body that sets standards. They tried to get them to transfer their standards to them. There was a big conference, World Internet Telecommunications Conference, WICIT, and these meetings usually end in unanimity. There was the outcome of this meeting was to make a change in what's called the International Telecommunication Regulations, to incorporate the internet into that. And when you make changes to that, that's a treaty document. 89 nations supported that. The changes they wanted to make in 55 did not. That was a major signal that there was bedlam in cyberspace. So there are vehicles, there are platforms. Nothing out there is perfect, but and there are debates about whether multi-stakeholder governance, the way it's deployed, is effective or not. I have my own serious reservations about it, but it's a vibrant place and there's a lot of activity.
Okay, Ed, I want to say time for John Patterson. The fake news thing. So, any other particular comments that we have to help our discussion? Well, I'll make one comment and then ask a question. Your draft suggests that we ought to look seriously at some kind of international agency.
It doesn't actually explicitly mention that, but that's one idea that I raised to you, that if the group feels that it's worth doing, we could add it.
Well, it'd be interesting to get the feedback and give it to us. My sense is that there's a compelling reason for that. At least some kind of internationally sanctioned body, UN connected, which gets serious about this in a very serious way. At least years ago. I have one other question. People don't know what the other person asked. So did we blow up the North Korean missile? We did. That didn't happen.
Why would we do that on a test when we could do it if they had never actually launched? You're giving up a zero. That's just my logic.
You don't think it might have been better this way?
Could have been just North Korea's bad missiles.
Yeah. Do we know? Do you know any? Nobody knows. Nobody out there knows.
Oh, they're not talking.
No comment.
No comment from you or no comment from, well, it's going to be interesting. John Patterson, fake news, come on up here. Lead the discussion.
So you we don't have a clicker, do we? Yeah, we do that. So the second piece of our the G7 document that we provided you addresses the problem of fake news. I'm not going to summarize it. It's 2 pages. It's relatively short, and I invite you to take a look at it. I thought I'd depart a little bit from the script and just provide you a look inside of soft news. My initial reaction, or fake news, my initial reaction to fake news was very much like Mike's, where I thought this is something pretty old and not all that important, or not different enough to be all that important. As the social science research has come out, I've changed my opinion about that. I think it's a large problem and a disturbing one. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about its pervasiveness and why we're susceptible to it, why we fall for fake news. So this is just preliminary stuff. What we mean by fake news are pseudo news stories fabricated to be believable. Some are in the profit category. There are sites that produce these sensational stories and do it for profit reasons, trying to attract people to the site. I think what we're concerned about are the sites that do this with a political motive, that are essentially trying to influence public opinion in one way or another. And it's more prevalent than you might think. So this is on Facebook, and this is based on the number of shares, reactions, and comments in millions. And the blue line is items out of the mainstream news, and the red line is items that are fake news. And as you can see, by the end of the campaign, fake news was trafficking more heavily on Facebook than were actual news stories. And here's some examples of how much they penetrated the American mind during the election. So one of the fake news stories was about Pope Francis endorsing Donald Trump. 19% in a national survey said they had seen the story, and of those, about 2/3 said they thought it was believable. Another one of the fake news stories was Donald Trump sending his plane to transport 200 stranded Marines. 14%, 1 out of 7 roughly, saw that story. 84% thought it to be accurate. And then there was the story about the FBI agent and the email scandals found dead in an apparent murder. Suicide, again, fake news. 1 out of 5 roughly saw that story, and about 3 out of 4 thought it believable. So there's a lot of trafficking in false news or fake news, and it does penetrate, and it has a believability component for many. So I think what the news media do is they create a context that allows fake news to flourish. And this is just one example. This is the coverage of Hillary Clinton's coverage during the general election. If you look first at the right side of that chart, you'll see that her emails accounted for nearly 1/5 of her general election coverage. That happens to be more than 4 times the amount of coverage that the news media gave to her policy issues. So in many ways, they were kind of running the types of stories that most of the fake news stories are around personal traits, personal characteristics, what they've done as people. And the news media are also kind of beating that same drum. And then the other thing you can see, and it's the middle of the left chart, her email scandals were covered about 10-to-1 negative as opposed to positive. So, and what negative news does is it tends to feed the polarization. That's part of the American electorate, and polarization actually creates susceptibility, greater susceptibility to fake news. So here's just an example about kind of how the media feed into the polarization. So this is just CNN, by the way, and this is CNN during the entire general election campaign. And the number of times, if you were watching CNN around the clock, if you could stay awake that long to do that, how many times these Donald Trump kind of characterizations of Hillary Clinton were voiced on CNN during the campaign. So you take the two together, Crooked Hillary and Lock Her Up, they were voiced 3,000 times roughly on CNN. So oops, I don't know where that went to. Okay. And you know what? One of the reasons that fake news works is that a lot of citizens are motivated reasoners. They don't look at things critically. They look at things through their own lens, their own partisan lens. And information often is not a very good corrective of that. So what I've got here is the percentage of Republicans believing that Obama was not born in the US. And so in April of 2011, roughly 1 out of 4 released the birth certificate. It goes down very slightly, but still roughly 1 out of 4. And then we get into the 2012 election campaign, and it goes up to more than 1 out of 3, so that the sort of the information being dropped into the information flow, the actual fact of his birthplace, had very little effect on the percentage of Republicans believing that he was born in the U.S. Here's another example of motivated reasoning. So this is a poll, the April 2017 poll was just taken very recently, and the November poll was taken right after the election. This is Republicans, and whether they think the economy is excellent or poor. And obviously we have a Democratic president here. 1 out of 8 Republicans think that the economy is doing well. And now that we have a Republican president, even though the economy isn't all that much different than it was a few months ago, you've got 1 out of 2 Republicans thinks it's doing pretty well. That's what we mean by motivated reasoning, right? Where we align our beliefs about what's out there around our partisanship. Source credibility. This is a way station chart. So this poll was conducted last month by Fox News, and Fox News actually does pretty good polling. Respondents were asked, who do you trust more to tell the public the truth, the Trump administration or reporters who cover the administration? The American public was divided about 50-50 on that question. But then you filter it through partisanship, and you can see that Republicans trust Trump and Democrats trust the media. Again, kind of aligning our beliefs with where we're getting our messages and what we believe. And then this is why repetition really counts, and why I think we are in a different kind of world, Mike, is that one of the things about fake news is we tend to encounter it again and again. These messages come over and over, the lock her up, and so on. And we use heuristics, and partisanship obviously is a heuristic. For example, if you look at Americans' approval or disapproval of the bombing in Bosnia, Democrats liked it better than Republicans. You look at the troop surge in 2007, Republicans liked it better than Democrats. And what we're doing is filtering through whether there's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House. Another heuristic is familiarity. And so the more we hear something, the greater the likelihood that we are to believe it, right? So if in fact it is true, we're more likely to believe it. But familiarity still plays a role there. But if it's false, and that's what's interesting and why fake news operates pretty well for many people or affects many people, is that the more they hear it, the more likely they are to believe it, even if it's not true. I don't know what's going on here with these slides. And then here are the big obstacles to kind of combating misinformation, combating fake news, is that most of us are biased information seekers, and we think less critically about information that aligns with our bias. And then the repetition factor. That's a large part of these campaigns, fake news campaigns. And based on the research that social scientists are doing, here are some of the things that could be done, and some of those are in the report. Nip it at the source. Most fake news does not go viral in the classic sense of viral dissemination. It's actually driven by bots rather than by people sharing. Limit the spread. Facebook is now working with organizations to put warnings on some of the messages that are floating around on Facebook. What we found also is that when the parties are kind of united in combating a message that's out there, it's more likely to damp down fake news than when they're divided on that. And then somewhere along the line, we need to strengthen the voice of reliable sources that the media need to kind of step up. Their credibility, I think, has been damaged over the last couple of decades, and that's providing a seedbed for the effectiveness of fake news. Okay.
Why don't you say that?
Okay.
Leave the discussion. Thoughts, reactions? Things that you think we should do?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Llewellyn King. I do some television. I have a syndicated column, some radio. I think that the media is damaged. We're hurt. We're wounded, not fatally, but we're in a very terrible position. The traditional economics have failed at a time when there have been whole new challenges, and we really don't have an answer. We're using our old tools of verification against a new enemy, which is disinformation on a massive scale, which we've never had to deal with before. Talking to my colleagues in Washington, which are the last several days, we don't have a cohesive plan. We don't know how to deal with this. What we all have said, and we've said it for a little while now, is we have to double verify everything. No more single source stories. But that has nothing to do with cybersecurity. That had to do with the extent to which Judith Miller of the New York Times was handled by Chalabi and fed a lot of information of the Second Gulf War, and finally had to leave the newspaper. We are very sensitive to our vulnerability now, I think. On the other hand, you cannot run any kind of news organization, which is a very competitive business for all, competing for eyeballs, for readers, for ears, for listeners. We cannot sort of turn ourselves into something different than what we have always been. We cannot suddenly become fact checkers only. Fact checking is part of the new equation that never existed before. And we don't know. I think, personally, that we are very vulnerable to a sophisticated fake news. If one of the major newspapers, a very respected name of a very respected newspaper, were to be fed fake news in a very believable way, we could get some serious damage done, because you cannot retract things very easily in the way you could. The old defense that the public had against certain excesses in the media was through libel, but that has no application in this world, and there are no laws on the books to deal with willful disinformation designed to mislead the public by managing the media and putting out things that are palpably untrue. It appears later, but which seem to have some veracity at the time. It's a critical time. It's very sensitive. It is not helped at all by the President of the United States accusing very respectable media of being fake media, because it gives a new way for the public to attack the media. And there are parts of the establishment that have always been hostile to the media. I used to publish a group of defense papers, Defense Week, Navy News, etc. And I went to some military meeting, told somebody I was a journalist, and this general sat down next to me and began denouncing the media. Not my publications, but the media in general, not knowing that I might even have some sophistication. We're used to that. We're used to that. I mean, it happens all the time. I, in a very short period, had Pinochet, the dictator at the time in Chile, denounced the media to me. He said there were no problems. It was just the media in the West that gave him a bad. And then I had Jaworski say almost the same things in almost the same language in Poland, the communists. We're used to that. But now there is an ugliness, there is a dimension we have never dealt with, and we are not ready for it. Just as we were not ready for the impact of, on the business model of the news apparatus, we are not ready for the impact of fake news maliciously, deliberately, and concertedly directed at us. We don't have the filtering organization to do it. And we're unlikely to get it because news doesn't allow you a lot of time to think, to check, to recheck. There's a lot of said now about the speed of the 24-hour news cycle. It's not that so terribly fast now as to what it was. There's just more of it and more competitive people. But wire services have run for telephones ever since I've been in this business, which is 61 years now. Thank you.
So a couple of thoughts on that, Llewellyn. I think response of the media to Trump's claims about fake media are a good example of the point that familiarity actually, when used as a heuristic, it's more likely that people will think that the media are fake media simply by hearing it, even in the case of denunciations of the claim. So that the more it's voiced, whether it's coming from the media or for Trump, the greater the likelihood that the public will think that the news media are in the business of fake news. A couple of points about developments within the media, I think, that feed into this process. One, as you all know, there's been a real financial challenge in news organizations as circulations have declined, as ratings have declined, and cutbacks in the newsroom. And some of those early cutbacks and most substantial cutbacks have been in this realm of fact-checking. Those were some of the first people to go, and they've also reduced the number of editorial layers that a story goes through in the process of getting aired, and that increases the likelihood that the information that gets out there from the actual news media will in fact not be very accurate. And then I do think the speed does matter in the sense that and the audience competition that you're talking about, these two things come together to lead news organizations to put more and more stuff out in snippets, smaller pieces, and to do so with greater frequency. And they've also learned that what grabs people's attention are the headlines, and so they've jacked up the headlines. The problem there is that what we've found in the study of fake news is that most of the sharers are simply a response to the headlines. Most of the people who share these items don't even get past the first paragraph of the news story. It's the headline that basically drives the sharing. So that to some degree, some of the developments, because of the financial pressures that have happened within the news industry, actually kind of feed some of the habits that are making this a more robust phenomena than it otherwise would be. Yeah, Barry.
I would hope that soon the fact that fake news has now become national policy would cause universities, great universities that have strong journalism departments like Harvard, to feel morally compelled and viscerally fearful and start up their own fact-checking organizations like the Annenberg Center that does PolitiFact. Because we have a president that just in the past few days has called the New York Times failing, has called opinion polls fake, has called job numbers fake, has called, the list goes on. So it's not just Macedonian pimply teenagers that are creating fake news. It is a policy now that comes from the top that is enabled by it was interesting to see the lawsuit filed against Fox News, in which the former anchor talks about how when she left with acrimony, that Roger Ailes had, I believe the term was professional social influencers that were on his payroll that then went out and created false comments and falsely smeared her. And there's also the like farms that are paid by people like Mr. Ailes that will go out and all they do is just generate likes for stories, so they get more clicks and they move up higher in trending things. All of that is fake. And it's not Macedonian bad guys and North Koreans and Chinese hackers. Now, it is the top of our government and the most influential news, or one of the most influential news organizations in the United States. And I think that calls for a different response than simply dealing with pimply teenagers in Macedonia.
So a couple of thoughts on that, Barry. First of all, to correct the record, Harvard does not have a journalism school. And they've long prided themselves on the fact that they don't, and turned down in the early 1900s a very robust amount of money to start one. And but I do think universities have a role to play here, and I think Annenberg was a first mover with fact checking, and and has played an important role in that. The difficulty, and it goes to a point that Llewellyn made, is that in this modern system, information moves very quickly, and the truth kind of catches up slowly to the false claim, and universities are fairly slow-moving bodies, so there is a lot of collaborative effort now between universities, organizations like Facebook, and news organizations to try to address this problem. But I'm not sure that the institutional structure of the university is all that good for the problem. And I think the burden falls more, in my judgment, on players like Facebook and Twitter and the like. They've got the resources, and what it's going to take is a pretty diligent commitment on their part to really get into this area, spend a lot of money on it. What's unclear, and they've started to form these partnerships, right, and to put warning labels and the like on some, but it's a relatively small fraction of the messages that flow through those social media. What's not clear is just how far they will take such initiatives. And the other thing is, what's not clear is how scalable those initiatives are. And without scalability, given the torrent of messaging, it's really difficult to think about how you're going to solve this problem if you can't scale up some of these answers and some of these kind of ways of mitigating the problem. Yeah, please.
So I'm a neurologist and psychiatrist and behavioral neuroscientist, and so when
we're talking your game here.
So,
yeah.
You know, when one thinks about the factors and the processes that you articulated, you know, these are based upon evolutionarily conserved brain functions and processes that we are increasingly understanding now. And essentially what's happened is that people have figured out how to hack the human mind, if you will, psychology, and all the sorts of measures with repetition, with threat evocation, facial expression, you know, all of these sorts of things are driving a lot of the believability and, unfortunately, for the fake news and the and playing upon sort of deeply seated in-group, out-group emotional bias, threat, and identity systems. So if one thinks about how the Boston Global Forum can help, one thought is the following. In addition to these sorts of evidence-based approaches to blunting fake news, we may be able to help with prophylaxis. And by that, I mean, we have the Global Citizenship Initiative that Governor Kwan and you and you know, everyone has been promulgating, and global citizenship education as part of that, and becomes even more important in this time of anti-global sort of populism. At any rate, maybe a part of that the Boston Global Forum could put together is education around critical thinking, because it's critical thinking that allows one to potentially be aware that one is being manipulated, to become aware of the tricks that people use to do it, and in so doing, to be able to defend against it more easily. And so in addition to all the other measures, technological and nipping it at the source and so forth, verification, I'm wondering whether as part of our Boston Global Forum global citizenship education, whether education in critical thinking, which are the skills that human brains really need to adjudicate and to not be vulnerable to manipulation, might be something that we could think about.
So we do have a nod to that in the draft about that being an important part of of a 21st century education. I think a couple of developments in the media and in politics have really exacerbated the problem. If you go back to the earlier media system, where it was dominated by a few newspapers and by the broadcast networks, selective exposure was difficult for the individual, right? So you were exposed to both sides of the political debate. Selective perception, another one of those psychological processes, has always been there. So we do have that tendency to filter these things through our biases. But we were hearing both sides. But in the new media system, we don't have to do that. We can go to a site or rely heavily on an outlet that plays to our bias, right? That makes it difficult. I don't think that's going to change. One of the things that's changed in politics that's fed this is this development of identity politics, which is a much larger part of our politics today than it was 30 years ago. Some people have described it as the reemergence of tribalism. And it's social identity in many ways that's the filter for many of these judgments. And it does override critical thinking for many people. So I agree entirely on the need. That's a long-term solution, kind of improving that kind of educational process and outcome. We've got some short-term problems here. And, I don't know how we outgrow tribalism once it gets embedded into the political fabric. And I just don't see anything in the short term, at least, that's going to reverse that trend tendency. Please.
Let me make a comment from my geographical viewpoint from Finland. In Finland, we've had a big problem with fake news coming from the Russian side. Finland shares a 1,000-mile border with the Russians. And I don't work with fake news or with this problem myself at all, but I have many contacts who do. And the point I want to make is that many of those persons who have stood up and researched this and worked against fake news have become targets of very well orchestrated campaigns, smear campaigns online. So that's something which is good to keep in mind. I'm not, of course, trying to warn anybody from fighting against this. This is a very important war to fight. But you will be fought against. For example, one female journalist that I know who works with this, if you Google her name, the first 2 or 3 pages are all about her drug problems, which don't exist. But by Googling her, you think she's a drug user, because this is the kind of smear campaigns they run against anybody who tries to fight them, and that's good to keep in mind.
So I grew up in the rural Midwest, and I've never Googled myself. So
what? Try it.
And I never read the reviews of my books. So I maybe I should go look and see what they're doing to my reputation. Yeah, please. Yeah. We're kind of working around it. Yeah.
I recently had a discussion on this whole point with fake news. One of the important aspects of the statement is putting in some type of ethics or ethical code. I think that's important. Ethics is really at the bedrock of where we're moving in respect to cyberspace, because we have such a lack of ethics. So few young people have a sense of moral fabric to make or even the tools to make the ethical decisions. And there are fewer and fewer people teaching ethics for the Association of Professional Ethics. Out of 1.5 million graduates, year before last, only 0.5%, 7,500 majored in philosophy and studying ethics. So there are fewer people even coming into teach ethics. So I know recently an article was, I believe it's USA Today, that said that Google, now Facebook should hire, and other companies should hire ethicists as part of their staff to give a review to help combat fake news. A colleague of mine at Santa Clara University, the Margolis Center, is called on frequently in Silicon Valley to come in and to give ethics counsel and foundational instruction with respect to critical thinking, which is quite important. So I think, a strong statement in this proposal would be beneficial and have an impact. Thank you.
Leslie, do you still have a question?
I have a puzzle about how you define the phenomenon.
Yeah.
Everything you said, I believe I understand. I believe I But in the following case, and I'm not speaking on the Pope or the President or the Macedonian, whatever. But remember the story about the Armada? We have this big, huge Armada we're going to send to Korea to go. Remember that part? It came out from, I just happened to be watching TV at the time. And so my question is, if we look at the whole story, yes, there were both ships, whatever they were, going. And yes, the president was telling us this was the case. The implication, we all thought, at least I did, because I think he may have mentioned Korea, but they were going in the other direction.
Yeah.
So how would we address this phenomenon? Or how would, is this fake anything?
So, I think the news media are struggling with that problem. And, by tradition, they report what top leaders say, and at least in the first blush, kind of take what they say kind of at the word, right? And I think they're really grappling with how to deal with these claims that increasingly are not true, coming from the people they cover.
Half of it was true. Half of it was true. Yes, there was an Armada.
Oh, there was an Armada. I mean, there are lots of ships, right? But I think the news media have to come to grips with that. I think that's been one of the big debates that's been underway among journalists within news organizations since almost the beginning of Trump's candidacy, and certainly it's accelerated with the Trump presidency.
That issue falls in kind of a special area where the news people have been struggling with that for years. Back in World War II, even if you knew, U.S. troops to land on the beach of Normandy, you wouldn't go with it because it would be so harmful to the interests of the nation you represented. Whereas if you were a German newspaper, you should blast it all over. And the U.S. and other countries have in the past greatly benefited from engineering false stories. The whole movie, The Man Who Wasn't There, is the story about how they created this person and grabbed the dead body and dressed him up like he had documents about the false invasion.
It's a question of maybe definitional, and maybe this is not the time to nitpick about things. Because if we say, go back to the source, we have the source. If we say the action, we have the action. It's just that it's the rest of it that is not. So maybe it's a fact-checking issue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic conversation. I'm very glad that you mentioned the Global Citizenship Education Initiative and the UNESCO UCLA Chair on Global Learning and Global Citizenship Education. So that's one of the topics that intrigue me greatly. My question is very simple put. When Enron went bankrupt, every corporation in this country rushed to have an ethicist on their board evaluating the way they do it. Was that because every corporation in this world is nice, or because there are legal implications of their actions? So if that is the level of standards, ethically, what kind of standards can we apply in this context of fake news? I thought that in terms of intellectual property or in terms of intellectual development, academics, many are here, we have some standards. Peer review, we are evaluated by committees. Our work is always connected with some kind of expertise. This expertise is accrued through PhDs or other experiences. So there are rules to which we are induced and promoted. Those rules obviously do not apply for this new cyberspace, which I do believe is a new frontier for global citizenship education. So I have just 2 points to make from the perspective of social sciences. The first, in addition to the need for the conversation on ethics. The first part is that we have forgotten the developments in social sciences in the 80s of postmodernism. Postmodernism has created a model in which every narrative replaces reality. Or put it differently, every reality constructed through a narrative becomes a reality. And people don't tend to investigate the theory, the methods, the empirical data, etc. Just as long as the narrative is verosimile, it plays a role in our understanding of reality. So I think the 2 elements that include this conversation, number 1 is epistemology. We tend to forget the basics of the epistemology of how we define what is truthful and what is not. In other terms, what is really the opposition to fake news? Is authentic news? Is truthful news? Verosimile news? So the whole argument about what is the opposition of fake needs to be discussed. And the last point I want to make is this. In a way, one of the great dilemmas of the US now is the unity of the country. Now, this is not new. This is not because of Trump. This country has been divided in the middle for a long, long time. I wonder if the conversation on fake news or ethics could also be included in a conversation on what happened next. And I gave a presentation recently in which I argue that in situations as drastic as this one, the answers are essentially 2. One is the one that Obama gave yesterday. You don't trust the governments, trust the civil society, trust the national organizations of youth, and so on, created a new leadership. And that, of course, requires a different understanding of the news, particularly connected with NGOs. The other option is a government of national unity, which, in the context of the current conversation, does not seem to be possible. So, in other terms, if we don't establish ethical standards, what kind of standards one can be upheld? If we don't look epistemologically and ethically at what is happening, how we can criticize it? And finally, if we don't really have a perspective of what's coming next, how can we discuss the present?
So, yeah, I'm in general agreement with your position. In terms of practical thinking about this, in terms of just thinking about the press and the role of the media in kind of correcting misinformation and not being a source of disinformation, I think their traditional model is a problem where even though they claim that truth is and accuracy are their primary goal, they've always had operationally had a very narrow definition of what truth is. And it wasn't about whether the larger part or the larger framing of a story was accurate, whether they were embedding an event properly in the larger context, in some larger narrative, if you will. The question was whether the discrete facts in the story were accurate or not. So an accurate report could in fact include something that's false, as long as, for example, the quote about that false statement was accurate, then it, by the definition of, and I think the press is really starting to grapple with the inadequacy of that particular model in the current information environment, and that some other kind of standard needs to govern something that actually is closer to a kind of a larger kind of conception of truth. The difficulty that I see, though, is that, and Llewellyn could speak better to this than I can, that the daily rhythms of the news cycle really work against doing that big picture, getting it right story, doing that consistently and doing it well. Because what journalists are really looking at, they're looking at the margins of human behavior. So it's what's different about today from yesterday. And when the margins are what you're concentrating on, that little bit of change, and you're magnifying it into kind of a story, you're going to distort kind of the larger picture. For example, during the campaign, the press never told the American public why these emails were so important. That was never part of the story, that larger question about why are we so concerned about Hillary Clinton's email behavior. And they've fallen off the table since the election. So in some level, they couldn't have been all that important. But what was driving the story was the margins and any new development in that story. And of course, the other thing that was driving it, which has become a larger part of the news, I did a study a couple of years ago that shows this has increased by about 2. The press increasingly has played up conflict because conflict is an audience pleaser. And audiences are attracted to conflict in a way that they're not attracted to cooperation. So that most political stories today are about political conflict. They're not about people working together and trying to make progress on common problems. And of course, then that feeds into the polarization, and the polarization helps create a seedbed for receptiveness to fake news.
Is there any evidence that the Twitters, the Facebooks are taking this seriously? Can you suggest they?
Yeah, I think Facebook is. You look, I mean, the fake news is kind of not my part of the media study area, so that I'm really working off of, and a couple of those slides were from my studies, but most of them were from the studies done by others. Facebook is trying to figure out what to do about this problem. I think they know they have a problem on their hands, and they are starting to create these collaborative relationships and figuring out how to label false messages or fake messages in their system, and also shutting down some of these, denying access to some of these sites. I think they're working on it, but boy, this is a movable target, and it's a big target. And
do the new metrics have a role in this? Like now, once upon a time, the Washington Post and the New York Times were measured by their subscription number. People got a whole piece of paper and they read the whole thing, or some of them. But now the measures tend to be clicks and likes and page views, which, as you pointed out, conflict and the headline, it's like saying it's easier to get somebody to look over there and go, oh, look, an accident.
Everybody loves a fight, right?
So the metrics, the new kind of metrics, the way we measure things for purposes of commerce, have a role in this?
Well, I think so, but I think that's at least in television, on the television side, that's been out there for decades, of course, with the ratings and looking at the overnights and all of that. So that, but increasingly they use a broader range of metrics. And one reason they broadened the range of metrics was so that they could extract a little more money from their advertisers, to say that kind of the ordinary metrics that we use, like circulation, are only tapping half of the exposure that you're getting through our news organization. So, I think that's commercially driven, but once you start looking at those metrics, then that starts to drive some of your decisions about what you're going to, what works, right? So, one way of looking at the metrics is you look at just the raw numbers to see kind of the advertising potential, but you also look at the marginal change and what the marginal change is in response to. And, they also kind of learn that some things don't help as much. Some of the things we'd like to see, some of the kinds of stories that really make the biggest public impact. The Globe did a story where I think it cost them $300,000 to do the investigative piece. And their estimate of the financial yield of that story was $10,000. That it didn't bring them anywhere near the revenue that it was the investment. And when hard-pressed news organizations look at examples like that, one of the things they begin to cut back is on their investigative reporting, their in-depth reporting. So, I think the dynamics of the marketplace right now are working against kind of, some of the things we'd like to see happening on the side of the media as a counter to what's happening in the fake news world.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Now is a very important moment of our conference. that the Governor Michael Dukakis, Chairman of Boston Global Forum, will come and present, give our initiative at the BGF G7 Summit initiative that is named, this year we named the Town Mina Plan 2017 to submit to G7 Summit, and now we invite Consul General DeSanti came together to receive our contribution to G7 Summit.
I'm not sure we ought to make this formal, because I'm still concerned. I mean, I do think we've got to, John, beef up this a little bit in terms of, at least my own view, and I don't feel free to dissent, to create something now in the way of an international organization.
An institution of some kind.
And you suggest that, but any objection to that? It does seem to me this needs, from what I've heard this morning, I think we need something in the way of a.
You want the new Geneva Convention regarding weapons of mass disinformation.
Well, you know, Microsoft.
I don't know if Barry would put it exactly that way, but look, this is serious stuff, folks. And I think
Since he's here, I mean, we could have the photo op, right?
Okay.
And
We'll
then
do the photo op with
follow
perhaps.
up with a revised document.
Why don't we do that?
By the
Is that okay?
Microsoft,
Yes.
Microsoft has actually proposed a digital Geneva Convention.
Yes.
And the subject would be, the purpose of the thing would be to help address the attribution problem, make attribution more accurate, and do it in an objective fashion. I think it's going to be a very hard objective to reach, but it's a starting point for a discussion.
Well, this presentation is not fake news, but we may revise and improve a bit. Okay, so we'll do the follow up.
Yes, we'll follow up and continue to do more.
Mr. General, this may include some modest revision.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Please.
Thank you all for another great discussion. Anyway, thanks for great discussion. Move the ball forward. Everything I've heard this morning suggests that this problem.
Sorry? I guess.
Sooner rather than later. So thank you all. And John, you, Nico, special thanks to you for your contribution. Appreciate it.